Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. When one talks about commercial airports in Connecticut, well, you'd be forgiven for replying with the automatic default answer of Bradley International Airport in Windsor Locks. After all, it is the largest commercial airport in Connecticut, and it's the only one with international service. But there is a second commercial airport, Tweed-New Haven, located in both New Haven and East Haven. Our guest today, Jason Bischoff-Wurstle, is Director of Photo Archives at the New Haven Museum, and he's got some remarkable stories about Tweed-New Haven Airport, its history, and some highlights that you won't believe from its past. He's also going to be along to tell us about the airport's namesake, an intriguing character named Jack Tweed. This week's trivia question: if we said we were looking to settle the argument over English settlements, which town would we be talking about? Stick around after the main program for that answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Well, we kind of take flying for granted today, even though it's really not that old of a technology. We go to the airport, we check our luggage, go through security, wait in the lounge for a flight that all too often is delayed. Of course, all this assumes you're not a rich or famous person that has your own personal jet, so you can bypass all that. We're talking today about airports in Connecticut, and the oldest one, the very first one ever built, is just 110 years old. I'll bet you can't guess where it was built. Well, it's in Plainville, and it's called Robertson Airport, opened in 1911 as a grassy meadow for novice pilots. Today, of course, the runway is paved, and it's located right next to where the Farmington Canal used to run through Plainville. That was the canal that went from New Haven into Massachusetts back in the early 1800s before trains came and blew away the canals. Well, in the 1920s, about 10 years after Plainville opened, more airports started to pop up in Connecticut, and they started to come a little bit more frequently. For example, 1921, that was Hartford Brainerd. That's on the banks of the Connecticut River just south of downtown Hartford. By 1929, 3 more airports would open: Groton, New London, and by the way, Amelia Earhart flew there to get married. Wallingford Airport and Bridgeport Airport also opened in 1929, and you may know it today by its namesake, Sikorsky Airport. In 1930, Danbury Airport opened, which is today, by the way, the state's busiest airport in terms of takeoffs and landings. In 1931, a year after Danbury opened, New Haven Airport opened. Now, it wouldn't be renamed Tweed-New Haven until the 1960s, and we'll have the story on that in just a bit. It would be another decade after New Haven opened that Bradley International Airport opened. It was in 1941 in Windsor Locks. The story behind Tweed-New Haven is an intriguing one, and here to tell us all about it is Jason Bischoff-Wurstle, no stranger here at Amazing Tales CT. He's the Director of Photo Archives at the New Haven Museum. Jason, when we talk about airports in Connecticut, it's nobody's fault, but we end up always talking about Bradley International Airport in Windsor Locks because it's got that name International in it. It's a big airport, and you can get flights overseas. But there are 2 commercial airports in Connecticut, and the other one is Tweed-New Haven, and I think it gets short shrift. And we're here today to try and set the record straight on Tweed. And it's a fascinating airport. I'm really happy to have you on because you know a whole lot about this. Let's start off talking about just how important it is for any city, anywhere, to have an airport. What does this bring, and what does it mean to New Haven?
Basically, this connects you quickly to the region, the rest of the country, and in the case of Bradley, internationally as well. you have that quick turnaround, that quick entrance, basically gate back and forth that literally opens up doors to economic opportunities. Say for instance with universities, what have you, travel back and forth. The universities can grow because students can move faster. And then of course there's, the other side of that coin as well.
What are the negatives of having an airport in the area?
Air travel is very bad for the environment. You use this quite a bit of fuel. You have noise pollution. If you live in the area, you have that noise. You have the jets coming and going. You have the added activity. So quality of life issues are a problem.
Now, when you talk about the technology of airports, and by that I mean airplanes, so it wasn't all that long ago, the early 1800s, that people were riding around in stagecoaches in this state. And then the trains came in and replaced that, and the Farmington Canal, of course, out of New Haven. And trains came along for a while, and then cars came along, and next thing you know, Orville and Wilbur brought us planes. And, when you look at Tweed-New Haven Airport, it hasn't even been open 100 years. So when you talk about this wave of transportation technology, tell us what it was like. I mean, these were kind of the romantic days of airports, when you had those curved hangar top buildings and, and a couple of crop dusters flying out of there. I mean, it had a dirt runway and one floodlight, as I understand it. Tell us about that.
What's really interesting about Tweed is it is still an operational, regional, and growing airport that adapted from being one of the very earliest airports. So the funds were created and raised by the city to use as a service, similar to bus station or train station. The popularity in air flight was just, forgive the pun, taking off after World War One. But one thing I always like to point out about World War One is it was a giant boom of technology. And it's what took the modern world from the 19th century to the 20th century. And air flight was one of those things. So this is where it became popularized from being more of a hobby or more of experimental, and it was sped up.
And when it opened, in fact, for the first 30 years that it was open, there was no control tower. It started off with this 4 million candle power floodlight that did the whole field. So I guess they did have some nighttime flying. But the other part I wanted to point out was, just recently LaGuardia Airport was completely revamped. It cost billions of dollars. I was stunned to find out that New Haven Airport, when it opened in 1931, was completed for less than $500,000.
Yes, but again, you got to think about what $500,000 cost. But absolutely, the runways were just graded. They were sort of packed dirt. It was only later, once the U.S. government took it over during the period of World War II, that the runways became paved and they were expanded. So you had this airport that opened in 1931, and it was at the time the most economically built airport in the country, and it was $475,000. So that was the value of $2.80 per the current citizenry of New Haven at that point. That's a pretty good deal. It's like, okay, that's not bad. It costs us less than $3. And yes, it had a 4 million candle power floodlight that then illuminated the whole field. So it's great. We do have an image here at the museum, and it's wonderful. It's just, this one block that looks like what you'd figure, kind of like this giant lantern that was on the at the end of the field. And I just always loved that idea that, it's 4 million candles were packed into that light. And that did illuminate the field, and it was able to run at night. It wasn't necessarily on all the time. You had a night watchman that would, if it was necessary, would turn on, activate all the lights, and allow travelers to come in. Although it wasn't all too common, air flight at night at that point especially wasn't all that common.
Now, when you talk about the Air Force coming in or the Army coming in and taking over the airport from 1943 to 1945 during World War II, that's a pretty extreme step. Why did they do that? What were they doing there? And how was service interrupted?
It does sound extreme, but at that point, it was commonplace for commercial airports, especially railroads and whatnot, to actually be essentially commandeered by the military and the U.S. government. So this was kind of just standard operating procedure to do that. And they would use this for the U.S. Air Force. They were training radio and maintenance personnel. They also had a small put-together airfield at the Yale Bowl as well. So again, sort of training grounds, and along the way, updated the field to a little more modern sense. Prior to that, the city didn't actually build any of the hangars that were there. They would contract out to whatever airline was contracted to come in. The airlines would have to build their own facilities and their own hangars on the airport grounds.
Let's talk about this guy after whom the airport gets its name of Tweed-New Haven. And this guy's name is Jack Tweed. He was from Madison. And just the key thing is he was the first manager of the airport, but he's so much more. Tell me about Jack Tweed's early life.
Jack Tweed was a very early pioneer of aviation. He was the third person in Connecticut to get a pilot's license. And again, in World War I, he was in the Naval Reserve and became a lieutenant and then an instructor. He helped to build the Naval Air Station at Coco Solo, which was in the Panama Canal Zone. And he was the first to fly the jungle route over the Isthmus of Panama. Kind of an innovator and definitely a pioneer at that point. He made his way back to Connecticut. He was continuing to experiment with this, and he was known as a test pilot, started doing kind of more long-distance flights. So he was one of the leading aviators in the country. This is a small group, and it would be similar to those who learned to fly jet planes. Generally, they learned in World War II as test pilots in the service, and then they went on to become the first captains of jet airliners. With Tweed, he became involved, and the thing about him is, and this is also part of why Tweed-New Haven was actually where it was located, he established and ran the very first New Haven Air Terminal, and it was a private operation. And he was running that concurrently over in the same area. This, though, was for flying boats, which are planes that land on water, for lack of a better description. And this became his specialized sort of field. And so he was running that for some time. He also helped tie together the U.S. Weather Bureau, who was establishing different weather stations, and had at that point only had a station in downtown New Haven. Later on, he helped to establish a weather station at this airport. So he was always involved on kind of the cusp of new tech, new innovations. Eventually, he became the full airport manager and ran all civilian operations about from 1943 until the military took over the airport, and then he took over again after that point.
And in 1961, when he passed away, that's the very year that they renamed it Tweed-New Haven Airport. Now, in 1971, there was a horrible accident. It was one of the worst plane crashes in Connecticut, although not the worst in terms of number of people killed. But this was a foggy day, as it were. But it was going, and I thought, kind of an odd route, going from D.C., flying up to New London, then over to Tweed, and then was going down to Newport News, Virginia. And it had 31 occupants on board, including 4 crew, and the rest were passengers. Pick up the story. What happened?
This was the Allegheny Airlines, and it was based out of Pennsylvania. And so later on, Allegheny Airlines became U.S. Air. It was June 7th, 1971. The basic facts with it was, yes, at the time there were 28 dead. It was a crash into East Haven, into Beach Avenue, into 3 beach cottages right on Long Island Sound. And it was due to heavy fog. It's kind of the background of it. Allegheny Airlines was a subsidized airline. So it was harder to kind of turn a profit, if you could pack more flights in to one day, you could kind of make some more money. There was also reputed to be bonuses for a flight crew. If you could make it faster, if your routes were faster and you got there on time or even beat the clock, you receive a larger bonus for the day. So there was that kind of incentive there. The captain was Captain David Gordon Eastridge, who was known as a very competent captain, but a very strict captain as well. So he knew the rules, but on this particular day, it seemed like he was kind of fudging with the rules. He took off and he'd altered the route to get to New London to kind of shave off a little bit of time and try to shave off the amount of fuel. But once they got to New London, there was this heavy fog, and it took them some time. It took, I believe, 3, possibly 4 attempts to land in New London. So by doing that, they were burning a little bit more fuel. And they were just shy of, they needed to have 6,000 gallons to make the rest of the trek that was scheduled. And they were just shy of that. And he kind of just ignored that and said, no, we're fine. We're fine. Because they didn't want to sit there and have to do the refueling, which would take them off mark. So they were kind of rushed, basically, and rushed through this really dense, heavy fog. So they took off again, and the flight between New London and New Haven is like, you go up and you come down. I want to say it's something along the lines of 13 minutes. And keep in mind, this was a jet at that point. Now, as it stands, the pilot did not use the sort of an instrument landing system. He was basically flying in control of the plane themselves. Tweed-New Haven at that point had an extended runway that would allow for instrument landing systems to be used, but there had been a court case on behalf of East Haven that blocked having that system installed at Tweed. So the runway is expanded. They could have brought the plane in if they were using that system, but they didn't have that system in place. And that was due to noise complaints at that point in the early 70s. So this wasn't there. So you have this really bad weather. Apparently in New Haven at that point, you couldn't bring your plane in with a tailwind coming in. The captain did, according to the black box recorder, ignore that and was coming in with a tailwind. And really, at one point, according to the recordings, got as low as 20 feet above the Long Island Sound. And apparently just right in front of them in the fog were these 3 houses. And they directly crashed into the shoreline. The captain was killed instantly. The first officer was actually ejected and was one of the few survivors. And then most of the occupants ended up passing away due to the fires that broke out because of the crash.
I understand that you've done some work to find out some of the celebrities that have flown through Tweed-New Haven Airport. What can you tell us about that?
You know, one in particular that comes to mind was President John F. Kennedy. JFK came in, and apparently there were no fences around the field. He would just be driving down through the shore and, you know, just the top wide open on his limo, you know, shaking hands with the kids, riding up on their bikes as the motorcade moved its way into New Haven. So you just had that accessibility, and it's still like, people still remember this distinctly in the neighborhood. Queen Elizabeth, who arrived here in the royal family in 1976. And she was actually in New Haven, strangely enough, for about a half hour. She arrived by boat at Long Wharf, came in, there were some ceremonies, you know, say hello, etc. Rode in a motorcade, went past the New Haven Green, and made her way out to Tweed-New Haven. And again, there was some photo ops and what have you, and then took off from Tweed.
The 1971 Allegheny Airlines crash led to important changes in FAA regulations, and those regulations remain to this day. For example, you get on a plane and the flight attendants show you where the emergency exits are. That's because the passengers that day in the New Haven crash couldn't find the exits due to the thick smoke. Most, in fact, died from smoke inhalation, not the impact itself. Also, those lights along the floor that direct you to the front and back of the plane, they were recommended due to that crash. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Just a few more quick comments about Tweed-New Haven Airport and its namesake. Jack Tweed was related to the infamous Boss Tweed, who ran the corrupt Tammany Hall political machine in New York State. He didn't take after his ancestor, though, but he did fly for the first time just 13 years after the Wright brothers. And one more fact, the runway for the airport actually marks the boundary between New Haven and East Haven. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Jason Bischoff-Wurstle, Director of Photo Archives at the New Haven Museum. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, if we said we were looking to settle the argument over English settlements, which town would we be talking about? Well, the answer is Wethersfield. It's the town with the first bona fide settlement by the English in Connecticut history. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to look at the issue of whether Wethersfield was the first town in Connecticut, but regardless, it has an incredible 400-year story to tell. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.